Hey, Tom.
Hey, Julie. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. So we're excited. Here's our second episode of How'd They Do It? Tech in the Cities.
Once again, want to thank our sponsors who've been very generous and allowed us to get this podcast off the ground. Uber, Spectrum, Civic Hall, TikTok, Google, and Snapchat.
We're so excited about this whole podcast. It's really an opportunity to kind of dig into some of the most interesting tech issues that are facing cities, that are facing states. Think about what that means in New York, see lessons learned from other places. It feels really great. Especially excited about this second episode, which has two segments.
We decided to pick a very easy topic, artificial intelligence. And our first segment is with the governor of New York State, Kathy Hochul, who's done some very interesting stuff over the past 4 months with AI, and we'll get into that with her. And then in our second segment, we're going to have a reporters roundtable on artificial intelligence with Zach Williams, who's the legislative correspondent from Bloomberg Government, and our very own Annie McDonough, who's our senior City Hall reporter at City and State, who's done a lot of coverage of tech as well.
We talked about a bunch of things with her. We talked about AI. Obviously, everyone in the world is paying so much attention to what's going on with AI. We also talked about some of the social media bills that she passed, that she recently signed into law, that the legislature passed. I kind of wanted to talk about that for a second. Tech NYC and a lot of our members, a lot of tech companies weren't thrilled with the way those bills turned out. Support, obviously, the intended purpose of ensuring that we protect kids online, but we had some concerns about the specifics about this approach.
What were some of those concerns?
I think the biggest concern is that we don't really know how these new rules are going to be implemented. The legislature kind of punted on the details. There's some sticky questions about how, for instance, you figure out how old someone is on the internet. There's some real privacy concerns with that. And because we don't have, the specifics aren't in the bill, there's going to be a rulemaking process through the Attorney General's office. And it's just, frankly, I think it's not great practice to pass these kind of huge laws without knowing what they're going to look like. I don't think it's the most democratic way to handle things. So that's troubling to me.
Typical government regulation. Yeah. But you still think there is room for tech and government to work together in promoting safe social media use. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the other things I worry about the particular way these bills passed is that bills somewhat like these, similar to these, not exactly the same, have been challenged in other states. They've been held up in other states. I think there's a real good chance these bills are going to be found unconstitutional by a court. I don't think they're going to help any kid in the near term. I think there's a lot that government and tech sector could work on in the near term that would more quickly arm families, arm kids, arm schools with tools to help navigate this stuff. We talk a little bit with the governor. I think you spoke with the reporters too about some of these ideas.
Yeah, I mean, the reporters were great. They gave us a perspective, not just about New York State, but what's going on around the country. Zach, who used to be one of our reporters at City and State, is really well versed in what's going on in other states and other cities, which is really what the intent of this episode and this whole podcast is, to learn best practices from other places. So I'm really looking forward to that segment. I think our readers will be very interested in hearing what Zach and Annie have to say.
I think that's right. I think we should just turn it over to the conversation we had with Governor Kathy Hochul, the 57th governor of the state of New York, the first woman governor of the state of New York. It was really great to talk to her, and I hope everyone enjoys the conversation.
Governor Hochul, it's such an incredible time to be involved in government, in politics. There's so much changing. The rapid evolution of technology makes that change feel so much faster than ever before. It's amazing because it offers a lot of opportunities, it presents a lot of challenges, and something that I've been so grateful for in your leadership is that you're meeting those challenges head on, especially as we have worked together on rolling out Empire AI. So I would love to start and give you just a moment to talk a bit about Empire AI, how it started, what it's going to look like, and hear from you what the plan is.
Well, Julie, you're absolutely right. And thank you for having me on this podcast, an opportunity to talk to you about what motivates me to want to ensure New York State's preeminence when it comes to technology and continuing to be an innovation hub that we've been for hundreds of years. We're about to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Erie Canal, which transformed New York City from a sleepy little village into an economic powerhouse that still is rules the world today, as well as creating economies all over upstate. That's the cusp of what we're on right now as we lean into the power of artificial intelligence. I have long believed that since the advent of this, that whoever owns this sector of our economy, whoever powers and harnesses this, will lead the next generation of technology. So being a New Yorker, I want to make sure that we are the first, we're the best. And so what we did after a conversation, I do a lot of breakfast conversations, as our friend Tom Allen knows. I sat down with Tom Secunda just last fall, and he knew of my passion for technology and innovation. And he came to us with an idea that said, let's talk about a way we can use the power of the private sector, but also be able to bring artificial intelligence opportunities to students and researchers all across the state of New York. Because if we wait for that to happen, it could be another decade because of the costs of establishing the supercomputing centers that are necessary. So I was hooked at the second, because when anyone tells me that this will mean we're first in the nation, they have my attention. So we worked out a plan, we call it Empire AI. First step for me was to introduce this to the state and to the legislature in my State of the State address just this past January. It was a bold idea. We had to win over legislators, but when they saw that we could take $275 million of state dollars and leverage that to bring in money from private colleges, our SUNY system, also our CUNY system, as well as the private sector, we could amass over $400 million to build a supercomputing center on one of our SUNY campuses that'll put power in the hands of students and researchers like no other state is doing. Because right now, this power is in the hands of private sector companies. So this is about democratizing the power of AI to solve society's problems and really make New York State the epicenter of this opportunity.
You talk about making New York the capital of responsible AI. What does that mean to you, responsible AI, and what should other states take away from New York's experience as a trailblazer here?
Well, we have to make sure that it's safe, it's responsible, and it's ethical. And we've already seen abuses. We know what is happening with deep fakes and all these other ways, especially even in the political world. We've seen images that are not representing the true person and what they actually said. It happens to people in entertainment. So the thought is we must work with the industries to figure out how we can manage that. But that should not be a barrier to ensuring that we use the power as a force of good and opportunity and literally create thousands of businesses and jobs in the process. So some people have a fear of AI. They think they only feel that it's going to lead to issues that we cannot overcome. I don't believe that. I believe that if we are all working together, which is why I have an emerging technologies advisory board that'll address this as well, led by the CEO of IBM, Arvind Krishna, and the CEO of Girls Who Code, to make sure that we're also leaning hard into bringing people who otherwise would be left on the sidelines, especially young girls of color, bringing them into the conversation with Dr. Tarika Barrett as well. So we're thinking about this holistically. This is no longer going to just be a tech bros world. We are going to innovate in a way that is going to be inclusive, represents the people of our state, and done in an ethical fashion.
I love that. I just have to jump in. I couldn't agree with you more that this cannot be a tech bros world anymore. I think you said it perfectly. It's part of what I love so much about doing this work in New York. It really kind of speaks to some of our natural strengths as a city and as a state. It feels different than some other, other places that are kind of tech centric in the country. And so we're super grateful for that opportunity to build these things here. I want to dig in just a little bit on what you just started talking about, Governor, with regard to Tarika and Girls Who Code, and really thinking about how we are all working together to make sure that all boats rise in this moment of economic and technological change, and what we can and should be doing and thinking about to ensure that all New Yorkers are going to benefit from these technologies and the changes they bring to our economy.
First of all, if you can give someone the dignity of a good paying job, that opens up so many opportunities for them to live the American dream, live the New York dream. And we think about newly arriving immigrants. We think about people in underserved communities. We think about people who feel they've been left behind, and young women have not felt that this opportunity is open to them. That we also know that if bringing together students from SUNY and CUNY, more affordable institutions, public institutions, we put this power in their hands and give them access to technology that they otherwise would not. Now we are bringing them up the ladders of opportunity. That's what this is all about, creating ladders of opportunity that'll take people to new heights that they otherwise would not achieve. So this is what's so exciting about this. And I love the idea that there's now people talking about this. They have not been engaged in this conversation. I'm traveling all over the state. And you look at not just what we're doing in New York City, but all over New York. One thing that I'm real excited about with this Micron opportunity, we're literally changing the curriculum in the surrounding 9 counties of schools to focus on STEM education in public schools. Think about that. Now, little girls and little boys who are now going to be learning about how they can use STEM and a STEM education to prepare them for these jobs. Number one, we're making it better for employers. They will have a more educated workforce coming out of our educational system, but also creating an opportunity that otherwise would not be there. So we're trying to meet the demand right now, because I know we're going to need thousands and thousands more tech jobs, as we talked about. 2023, New York State became the #1 destination for people in tech jobs looking for a new opportunity. That is extraordinary. And we've now surpassed the number of Wall Street jobs with people in tech jobs. I'm proud of that. I love the fact that we are an epicenter of tech and this new post-pandemic world where people no longer want to be in, isolated suburban office parks, even with all the great amenities. That was so yesteryear. Now people want to be in denser populations, the creative collisions, the energy just from walking down the street in places like New York or our upstate communities. It's real. It has a gravitational pull. People want to be in New York. And that's why we have to meet the demand with more housing, making sure our streets are safer, continuing to invest in education. But I want all the employers to know that you build your business here, you'll have access to people who are now educated in ways other states are not leaning into. We'll have the power of artificial intelligence. And again, semiconductors, this is going to be the place for people to be. And it is an exciting, exciting chapter in our state's history.
Governor, one of the inspirations for this podcast, we call it How They Do It, Tech in the Cities, is looking at what is going on in other states, other cities, other countries. Are there any other places that have inspired you and are doing great things in supporting AI or using AI or other types of technology initiatives?
Well, certainly as I've traveled a number of times out to the tech centers of California, looking at what they're doing there, what they're leaning into. Certainly there are more companies right now in the tech space, in artificial intelligence in California, but we're rethinking the whole ecosystem around that. And like I said, democratizing, making it more inclusive and giving people opportunities. So we're going to have a very different workforce and a different approach to it, but certainly looking back to legacy states like California gives us something to build off of. I think that other states will be looking at us. And when I speak at governors' meetings around the country, and we have an opportunity to share what we're doing with Empire AI, there is a little bit of sense of, oh, New York went first again. And let us make the playbook that we can share with others, because this will propel our state and also our nation to be more competitive with places like South Asia and China and others who are competing with on the global stage.
I would say that I think it puts us out front more than a little bit. I mean, I think it puts New York squarely out front on this issue. It's just so great for the state. It's just so really, really wonderful to be out front on that. I think that Empire AI, not to talk about the Valley, but to my mind, if you think 20 years ago, what Stanford did for the Valley, that's what Empire AI is set up to do for New York. Okay, you talked about Micron briefly, Governor. You talked a little bit about what's happening in Syracuse, but I want to spend just a couple more minutes there, because I think part of what's so exciting about what's happening in New York is we've got obviously a booming startup ecosystem in the city. We're going to be building this amazing computer in Buffalo. And what's happening in Syracuse is just unbelievable. And the scale of it is truly magnificent. And I was hoping you could give a little bit more context about how you got Micron to come to New York and kind of what the vision is there. When you talk about needing thousands of engineers, I know some of them are going to need to be in Syracuse, for instance.
Well, Julie, this is something I'm extremely proud of. I literally became aware of this opportunity my first week as governor and hosted Micron executives in my office, literally the week I was just finding out where my conference room was. So it was brand new, but I went to school at Syracuse University. I know the legacy of hard work and that sense of a strong work ethic that exists all over our state, but really focused on those Erie Canal communities, the old Rust Belt communities where people really stick with jobs when they have them. And I'll tell you how I leveraged that into my arguments with Micron. I also then had an opportunity to fly the next January in a snowstorm to have an opportunity to meet very briefly with the CEO of Micron, who was in town from his headquarters. So I went over to Syracuse. It was supposed to be about a half hour, maybe an hour meeting, and have quick cocktails. Then ended up being a 3-hour meeting when I was able to literally sell them on the value of New York State, our high quality of life, the entrepreneurial spirit, which is, we are unique in owning that space. And also just all the amenities of upstate New York and the low cost power and the beautiful attractions, the great communities, the small town charm, everything. I just really did a job to tell them how amazing it would be to have them in New York, that I would personally shepherd this through the process. I also knew that we'd have to have significant incentives on the table, as other states do as well, because Micron was very seriously looking at a number of other states because of the economic opportunities the states were affording them. So we were in a competitive environment. I had to get through the state legislature what I called a green chips bill, $10 billion of commitments from the legislature to fund projects like this. Now leverage this with what the federal government did with Chuck Schumer, who really gets so much credit for what he did in Washington and helping land Micron as well. When President Biden and Chuck Schumer, our majority leader, got this through the Congress and got it signed into law, 2 days later, I signed into law our incentive, because what the federal government did was create an environment that was more enticing for companies to do business in our country as opposed to other nations. But how would I get them to New York if I didn't have very strong incentives on the table? So I thank the legislature for supporting my vision. Once Micron knew we had this, I worked with the Department of Commerce incessantly to make sure they got their full approvals from the federal government. Cannot tell you how many phone calls we had with the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, and visits to Washington. That was cemented. President Biden announced this project in October of 2022, and people's jaws dropped. This is the largest private sector investment, $100 billion in American history. 50,000 jobs coming to Syracuse, New York. And the calls immediately started with all the supply chain companies that wanted a part of the action as we're building out this new tech corridor that'll go all the way from upstate to New York City. So it's all about creating opportunities for people. We will need more people to move here. We have to build more housing. We're actually building more roads and schools because we are transforming upstate New York and making it position to lead into the next century of innovation. So couple that with what we do in New York City. The upstate, downstate divide, in my opinion, should never have been talked about, but in my mind, it never exists going forward. It does not exist anymore because it is one state working together to make sure that we capitalize on this opportunity. So thousands of jobs, $500 million of community investment. We told them we want to build sustainably. They will do that. They're literally building childcare. I talked to them about how to bring more women into the workforce. I said, you build a childcare center on site, you'll get more women to be able to come into these opportunities. They're doing that as we speak. And these are going to be great paying jobs. So I could not be more delighted, as you could tell, proud of this. And I cannot wait to see what the future unfolds because it is very bright.
Governor, on a related topic, you've talked about public safety being your top priority and you've done some great things there. Last month, you announced $127 million in state funds for new public safety technology, some innovative stuff like gunshot detection systems, license plate readers, and drones. Can you talk a little bit about these initiatives and how excited you are about these things?
Yes, everything in our state is contingent on people feeling safe and secure in their homes and their workplaces and on the subway. So that's why I talk about public safety literally nonstop and bringing more monies to the table to fund local policing opportunities, whether it's getting guns off the streets, creating a consortium, my first few months on the job, bringing together the power of 11 states, first time working together to track illegal guns coming up from the South into our state. But technology is a powerful tool and many localities can't afford it. So I said, it works, let's use it, and I will help fund it. So like something as simple as a license plate reader. This allows us to track crimes from one county to another neighborhood and have a statewide intelligence center that's analyzing the data, sharing it with localities, and we are beating back these criminals because we're winning the war against crime. Not there yet, a long way to go, and I'll never rest on our laurels as long as a single crime is committed. But we drive down places like Buffalo, from historic highs, Syracuse, Rochester, Albany, New York City, down from their highs of violent crimes and shootings and murders. From what they had been, they're down about 28 to 30%, depending on the part of the state. That's a tremendous trend that I want to make sure holds. So we'll continue investing in technology and helping localities bring to bear everything we can use in our war against crime.
You know, Governor, that got me thinking something we've talked about before, and something that I think is really interesting is what we're seeing in the tech sector nationally, if not internationally, is that tech companies will go where the people they want to hire are. And when we started Tech NYC in 2016, I think many of the issues our tech community cared the most about were things you would think of as kind of core tech policy issues. Over time, issues that I think of as more livability issues, which used to be secondary, are increasingly primary. How do we ensure that people want to live in New York, feel like they can stay here, they can raise their family here? And I say that because I have no doubt that if people feel like that, the companies will continue to double down on New York, because we all know that creative, interesting people want to be in New York. That's always been true. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you're thinking about that. Obviously, public safety is a part of it, as you just said, but I think there are more pieces as well, of course, housing, affordability, et cetera.
Julie, that's the foundation of everything we do in state government. You know, the guidelines, the guideposts that I follow. Public safety is the foundational side of all of this. We must have people be safe and feel safe wherever they are in our city. Secondly, it is about having housing that's available and affordable. And what I did just a couple months ago was what people thought was rather extraordinary, because no governor since the 1960s even talked about housing, because it is challenging the traditional norms and the status quo of letting the localities do whatever they want without feeling the necessity of building more housing. So what I did was to incentivize more housing growth, more apartments, more affordable housing, more market. Communities that are designated as pro-housing communities have available to them over $650 million this year now to fund projects in their communities, little downtown revitalization, safety measures, connections to the waterfront, parks, streetscapes. All of that is available to communities that buy into my vision for the state, which is we'll also make sure we're building more supply. New York City alone had so many barriers, archaic barriers since the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s that no one ever questioned on why buildings couldn't have a different density and height restrictions, and why we can't easily convert vacant office space into housing in a place like Midtown where you can have 24/7 communities. It all makes sense. Plus, you also need to have incentives for developers to build housing that's affordable, that the legislature removed 2 years ago, and housing starts went down 85%. I brought it back. So these were really hard-fought battles. But if I have a young person who wants to move here from California or Austin or North Carolina, I have to be able to offer them their first home that's affordable, their first apartment. And eventually they will become our millionaires and our billionaires and our wildly successful entrepreneurs, but they need a little bit of a runway to get there. In the meantime, let's support them as people newly arriving in our city. So it's about housing, it's about public safety, mental health, a lot of anxiety around people who are homeless and have mental health episodes on the subways and streets. We have worked so closely with the Adams administration to actually go into the subways, find people, develop relationships, persuade them to leave. We have over 500 people who were once long-term residents of the subway who did not have a home to go to at night, who are now in supportive housing. That's how you start taking down the temperature, people's anxiety levels, and giving people the help they need.
You've spoken about young families and mental health, and I'd be remiss in not asking you about the bill that you just passed restricting the algorithmic feeds of teenagers and minors. Are you happy with the legislation, and are there other things on your agenda for next year in this field?
I'm very proud of this legislation, and as we work through the regulations and the implementation, I've extended a hand out to technology companies to work with us, work with the Attorney General's office to make sure that we can do this responsibly. It is critically important to me as the first mom governor to make sure that we're doing everything we can to protect our children's mental health. And some of the stories that are emerging about what happens with Instagram sending very inappropriate, sexually contextualized images to young teenagers. This is a scary time for parents, whether you have older teenagers or kids in grade school or middle school. Parents should have the power to decide if algorithms that are designed to draw your children into more and more content viewing, whether parents want that to happen or not. And I'm going to suspect that most parents would want to be able to have the off switch on that, as well as messaging going to their children after midnight till 6 a.m. Our kids need their sleep. And what I'm talking about is not just children today. This is the future workforce for all of our businesses in the state of New York. And we want them to emerge from childhood and being teenagers in a mentally healthy space where they're used to interacting with human beings, that they're not going into this, 8-10 hours a day immersed into just staring at their smartphone, not out connecting with people in the real world, or even in classes, they're not paying attention. So I think the next frontier is to talk about the necessity of smartphones in classrooms. I'm a parent. I know the anxiety, especially with the onslaught of school shootings that have been, luckily not lately, but have dominated the news in the past. And to be able to connect with your child during the day, or to say, I'll be late picking you up. That can also be accomplished on a flip phone. You don't need to have it tied to social media platforms and the broader internet all day long while you're supposed to be paying attention to your teacher. So that's the next conversation. It's not something we can do right now without involving the legislature, but every school district can do that. And I would encourage them on their own to be looking at the success of other areas in our country where they have said you can't use your phone except for maybe recess, but let the kids be liberated and let them have the freedom that children should have. We are, and I said this on the news this morning, we are a pro-tech state. We are proud of our innovation. We're proud to be the magnet for all these great companies. And they're also parents, the people who work in these companies. They know what's happening. And if they would sit down and work with us and be on the same side of this, this war to protect our children's mental health, we can accomplish so much together. I'm excited about this. I do believe there's a tremendous opportunity for us to set a national standard that can be replicated all across the country that achieves the objectives of our companies, but also most importantly, making sure the objective is to protect the mental health of our children.
Spectrum is committed to expanding digital opportunity to more people across the country. With the Spectrum Digital Education Grant, we're able to fund organizations that are working to better their local communities through access, training, and technology labs, including professional advancement opportunities for adults and educational workshops for seniors, as well as providing resources for students. We're Spectrum, working together to advance digital inclusion and empower the future. Service not available in all areas. Restrictions apply.
I'm here with two award-winning reporters who cover New York City and New York State government, as well as technology issues. Zach Williams is a reporter who covers technology at Bloomberg Government and is also a former City and State Albany bureau chief. Welcome, Zach.
Thanks. Good to be here.
And Annie McDonough is City and State's current senior City Hall reporter and has covered technology issues extensively the past few years. Good morning, Annie. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Tom.
Welcome to both of you and to anybody listening to How They Did It, Tech in the Cities, our new podcast produced by City and State. My co-host, Julie Samuels, is out of town today, but I am going to be jumping in right now. So I think what we're going to talk about over the next period is going to be Governor Hochul and the active legislative session she had on technology issues. She seemed to focus on a couple of hot topics. Let's see if we can unpack them one by one. What are your views on her Empire AI plan, and what impact do you think it'll have in the short and long term on the state? Zach, you want to jump in?
Sure. Thanks again, Tom, for having me. About a year ago, there was artificial intelligence exploded as like an issue in state legislatures across the country, particularly what you might call the influencer states like California, Washington, Connecticut, New York. And culturally, it was also just rising in prominence. All these kind of lingering fears of, ChatGPT taking everyone's job and mass surveillance enabled by artificial intelligence getting adopted by more police departments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Governor Kathy Hochul in New York certainly noticed this as well. And, in her State of the State, she made several proposals that kind of aimed to bring New York kind of a little bit more to the forefront on AI regulations, because there really wasn't any existing to begin with. She proposed several of the low-hanging fruits that we've seen in like other states, like, for example, requiring disclosures on AI-created political ads. She also had a much more ambitious proposal that, would have made it very easy to kind of sue people who use your likeness, without your permission. This came after, like, Tom Hanks, for example, was in a fake AI generated ad. I think it was for some sort of like health product. So there was that, and then of course there was this idea for Empire AI, which, as proposed by the governor, was just like, basically, give us $250 million, it'll be awesome, and we're gonna like do some AI stuff by buying a supercomputer. And her administration really refused to give any sort of details whatsoever, while she touted the purported benefit of, spending $250 million directly from the state to buy this supercomputer, which later she divulged would be at the University of Buffalo. Then there was another $25 million to help SUNY kind of operate it. And then she brought in this consortium, which was of various universities, including Cornell, NYU, CUNY, SUNY, and a couple other schools that would, use the supercomputer to do cutting edge AI research. And she constantly cited, like this one researcher at Buffalo who was using, AI somehow to cram numbers about the foster care system, et cetera. So she certainly hyped it up a lot. She was very short on details. Eventually, the state Senate came back with a counter proposal that actually had any sort of details whatsoever. There would be a board. It would, intellectual property rights would rest with the consortium itself, not be in the public domain. Of course, building trades unions would get, their own lucrative provisions in that to build this thing. So, it kind of generated from this idea that the governor had, that'd be great, into something that we still have to see actually take real form. But, it all kind of comes down to a supercomputer for I believe 8 schools will, help their research. But, the idea that this is going to thrust New York to national leadership on artificial intelligence is just like completely absurd. Like, the California is #1 and all the other states are battling for second place. New Jersey The governor there, Phil Murphy, announced his own moonshot, which was likewise kind of short on details. That one was a bit less ambitious than Hochul's when it came to how much public money would go into it. But, like other governors, Phil Murphy, Hochul, and a couple others are trying to position their states to lure more tech business.
Interesting. Annie, since you cover the city as well, how do you see the Adams administration working with the governor on AI? And has the Adams administration articulated a vision on AI that will complement what the governor is doing?
So the thing about the Empire AI sort of release is that the governor also around the same time released an AI policy for how states can and should use AI tools, automated decision-making tools. And New York City last fall released its own sort of action plan on how to build an AI framework, very light on policy, the city's plan was, but sort of a roadmap for when they'll start making policies and what kinds of boards will be appointed to do that. The governor's policy has a little bit more detail. It says that state agencies should not be using automated decision tools to make final decisions in how services that affect the public will be used. It should be something that aids human decision making, not replaces it. A little bit more detail there. I think they're both kind of pursuing parallel goals here. I don't see how much coordination there is when it comes to exactly how the state and city governments will be using and harnessing AI. Potentially that's happening to some extent behind the scenes, but outwardly on that sort of vision and framework, how they will regulate state and city use, they're sort of pursuing on separate parallel tracks.
Interesting. And the governor and the mayor, both tout themselves as public safety people. That's their biggest goal. Are either of them talking about using AI in innovations in policing or public safety?
There's a little bit of that. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Zach, if you want to go.
And you can go. Anyone, why don't you go ahead?
I mean, the one thing that comes to mind for the mayor is he has talked about using these weapon detection systems in the subway. We've seen obviously a lot thrown by the governor and the mayor at public safety, particularly in the subway system. And the city is currently exploring using weapon detection scanners that have some sort of ill-defined element of AI, honestly. One of the main companies is called Evolve that cities looked at, still being explored, but we'll see if that actually gets deployed.
Interesting.
I would just add that, I asked the governor this question. Well, first off, artificial intelligence is already here. It's often spoken of speculatively, like it's going to really change things, but it already has. What are we talking about here? As Annie said, these weapon detection systems that have been deployed in some cities, facial recognition software, the type of automation algorithms that city and state has reported on before that determine things like housing benefits and other social benefits. So it's already around. Hochul has basically been okay with state agencies pursuing these technologies as much as they want. Yes, she came out with some guidelines earlier in the year, and they do assert some things that I think like privacy advocates, consumer advocates would do support, certainly requiring human intervention, final decision making is important, but it's still just guidelines. There was, if the governor really wants to show her commitment to kind of upping the game on oversight of how state agencies are using all these various technologies, then it'll be interesting to watch what she does with this piece of legislation passed by the legislature in June called the Loading Act that would codify a lot of what she put as guidelines into actual state law, and certainly give the legislature a bit more oversight powers into how the state itself is using this and how it's affecting really real people.
Interesting. So pivoting to the very hot topic of social media and teenagers, what about the governor's bill that got passed at the end of session limiting the social media algorithms for teenagers. Will that have a big impact? Did it go far enough? And is it just a prelude to a bigger attack on social media in 2025? Zach, you want to start?
Well, the Safe for Kids Act, on paper, it looks, it looks like it might actually do something. It basically says platforms need parents' permission to use algorithms to curate social media feeds or ping their phones between 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. And what parents are going to give their permission for that? So it basically says you need to make social media feeds chronological for users under 18 and don't ping them overnight. Now the only problem is how do you verify people's age? You privacy advocates got a lot of problems with saying, oh, show your ID. Well, what if the kid is undocumented? Something like that. Or you can't have something that's very minimal self-affirmation, where you just check a text box where you pinky swear you're over 18. So everything comes down to how Attorney General Letitia James will determine the specific rules on how platforms actually verify users' age, because otherwise this law isn't going to do anything. If the bar is too low, then kids and teens tend to be more savvy than than most internet users. They're going to get to use social media as they do now. If the bar is too high, then not only are you going to have problems with civil rights groups and privacy advocates, but the tech companies are going to sue. They already are threatening this. They've overturned similar laws in states like California. New York supposedly has a secret mix to survive these First Amendment challenges. But this law is not going to take effect for at least another year. And will it make a difference? We'll see.
Annie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think to Zach's point, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Zach, but pretty bipartisan support for this bill.
Yeah,
in the
nearly
legislature.
unanimous.
Yeah, I think just zooming out a bit, it's important to note why this is happening. Kids' mental health is declining. And there's a connection being made with the more addictive and damaging aspects of social media apps. It's something that New York City has studied a little bit recently. There was a recent report that suggested that kids who use social media are seeing high rates of anxiety and depression, and that's effect is exacerbated for teenagers. And I think that to the question of whether this is going to have a long-term impact or whether this is the beginning of a broader push against social media, it seems that the bipartisan support and the interest in studying this at the state and city level suggests that there is at least interest in posturing and going after the social media apps and companies. I think whether it works or not, this bill specifically, as Zach said, comes down to the rulemaking.
It seems like everybody from the Surgeon General on the federal level down to the New York City Health Commissioner want to put warnings on social media. Do you think that's something that A, will happen, and B, will that be effective on any level? Annie?
I mean, the comparison that I have is like smoking warning labels, and I think that kids are kids, and I don't know how much a warning label is going to deter kids. I think it's sort of a nail-defined role for government. How much is it lawmakers and elected officials' job to regulate how kids use social media and the internet? I think these are kind of tools to help parents make those calls potentially. And I mean, I don't know how much a warning label will actually change kids' use of social media, but we'll see.
Zach, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Annie put it pretty well that what we are seeing is a political backlash in action. This law is kind of a second wave, if you will, of blue states taking an issue that red states really dominated for a while, saying that social media was bad for kids, that it enables all sorts of wokeness or whatever. And now, in their own ways, blue states are doing it as well. And, this is literally that happening. The Safe for Kids Act is based on a law from Utah. Just go back to its legislative history. Look at the legislative language. The word groomer was in there when it was introduced in 2023.
Wow.
Disappeared, of course, when they came back in 2024 because it wasn't going to work, as a red state piece of legislation in New York. So something that tech companies are pushing for, something even, the other side, privacy advocates, children's advocates, et cetera, health experts, is action at the federal level. because, ultimately tech companies don't want a bunch of different rules, and they certainly don't want, blue states being, making legislation that can survive court challenges. So, if the federal government does something probably after the 2024 elections, that could preempt all of this. So, we'll see, will the Safer Kids Act actually help teens? I think, as Annie suggested, it's going to be pretty minimal. Kids are going to access social media, and whether they see a chronological social media feed or an algorithmically curated one, will only make a difference to some extent.
What I've never understood as a parent is why, there are parental controls that are built into phones and built into social media. I never understood them as a parent. So why doesn't the government embark on a education campaign with parents on how to use parental controls that exist? Would that
Well,
be
that's
would that be effective on some level?
I mean, I think what, certainly awareness helps. There's a million issues out there. And, when the governor of New York goes on and has a press conference about teen health, that's one more voice that's out there. I mean, ultimately, all these tech problems come down to what the federal government is doing or not doing. Are they addressing this issue? No. Congress can barely, pass a budget or pass aid for Ukraine and all these other things. So until then, we're just seeing states kind of do their laboratories of democracy thing. And, when there's a critical mass of states kind of doing the same thing, then we got a de facto national policy in place. We might see that too.
Yeah, Tom, to that question, actually, this was something that came up in this New York City study that I mentioned, where you did see parents registering that they feel like they don't have enough information. And there's actually an information gap with lower income households in New York City. This was a survey the city did. But I think, if the state and city are serious about attacking this in a sort of multi-pronged, universal way, awareness, information, public information is probably a part of that.
Is part of the problem that we have in government on the federal level and even on the state and city level, the fact that we just really don't have digital natives in office and people who understand technology. I'm not going to get into sort of the age issue. Probably the median age in Congress is very high. And on the state level and the city level, I can only name on one hand the number of people who come out of the technology industry or really understand technology issues. Do we need to elect more leaders who really understand technology so that we can get ahead of some of these issues as opposed to chasing some of them?
I mean, I've seen in states like so I guess there's two things. At the federal government in the 90s, Newt Gingrich became speaker, and he eliminated so many committee staff that, kind of were the intellectual core of Congress and, were go-to experts for members of Congress. What happened? Lobbyists gained power because they can hire people with tech experience, and, lawmakers don't have any of their own, so they got to listen to the lobbyists. The same thing you see in other states. In New York, legislators have resources that their colleagues in other legislatures would dream of. James Maroney, state senator in Connecticut, who was sponsoring SB2, which would have been a nation-leading bill had it passed both chambers. He shares an office with another senator and has one staff member. That's why he was talking to groups like the BSA, the Software Alliance, and they had a lot of input into the legislation as it involved. Companies like Microsoft, same thing. So, and you go to Colorado with Robert Rodriguez, who passed a similar piece of legislation just this year that was signed into law. He doesn't have nearly the resources that a state senator here in New York can have. So, then you come to New York. Yes, there's a lot of resources, but just a couple members of the legislature really know anything about tech. There was one member very high up there. He didn't even know what SEO meant when I talked to him earlier this year. So, yes, it's a problem, and expertise is in short supply, and that really gives an advantage to tech companies and the industry groups that represent them.
Just to clarify, what was SB2 in Connecticut you mentioned before?
SB2 was a piece of legislation that really would have thrust the state to the very lead and like regulating AI in the private sector. A similar bill passed in Colorado ultimately earlier this year. But basically, it would have required companies to follow a bunch of transparency requirements on the type of AI systems they're using, do things like impact assessments, say, oh, these are, some of the potential problems or ways that the system might be biased to vulnerable groups. This is how we intend on dealing with them. So it really would have been the first comprehensive law of any state in the country regulating AI use by private companies. Like I said, a similar bill passed in Colorado. It's a little different, in some of the details.
Interesting. Annie?
I mean, I think Zach summed it up pretty well there. I think that, we're going to see more digital natives coming into legislatures, state, federal level, gradually. I don't think that makes this an issue that's suddenly not challenging, though. I think that, other interests, the tech industry, their lobbying forces are going to be strong, no matter who's in office. But as Zach said, they might have a bit of an edge here when they're talking to people for whom there's just some, learning gap in kind of getting a handle on what is sometimes complicated technology when we're talking about, these algorithms that rule a lot of these social media apps.
Interesting. So getting to the sort of the issue of the day, Hochul has talked, like other governors, of banning cell phones in schools. This morning, the chancellor of the Department of Education talked about a ban in schools, although I didn't see specifics yet. Is this and I know in California they've had trouble getting this thing off the ground. When we look back at New York 20 years ago, our mayor, Mike Bloomberg, who's actually Zach's employer right now, he banned cell phones in schools for a while. What do you think is going to happen there? Is this something that's going to become widespread both in New York State and around the country, or is this something that's going to come under a lot of pushback?
There's certainly, as you mentioned, Tom, we're certainly seeing interest from both the city and the state. David Banks has suggested that something could be imminent. I think, like a lot of things we're talking about, we don't know the details yet. We don't know exactly how it would be implemented. I think the devil's in the details. Whether it's something that could withstand any potential challenges, whether it actually works in schools. I mean, I think sort of instituting a universal ban is one thing in theory. Getting schools to implement and enforce it across the board is another. As someone who came up through middle school and high school as like proliferation of cell phone use was happening in real time, it's not that easy to get kids from stop using their phones, and I don't know that that's where educators' priorities are going to be at the beginning and end of every school day. So it's, I think, very unproven right now, and even before that, it's hard to talk about when we don't know the details.
Yeah, I mean, how is the jewel ban working in schools? How has smoking bans worked in high schools over the last century? Enforcement's always key. There's so many different issues. How do you make sure a kid doesn't give a fake cell phone when they come in? I would just say that politically there can be a backlash from parents. Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie was asked about this very question, and he said what I think a lot of parents would say, which is, when I want to reach my kid, I want to reach my kid. And, it doesn't matter, school bans, whatever, I want to reach them. And I would just say, in places where they have banned schools, keep an eye on the contractors. How is the system working? A lot of them have have some sort of pouch set up where you bring it in, and, who's making money from all this? How are they connected to things? So I think the city register, where all these contracts might get posted, could get really interesting down the road if they ever pursued this ban. But I'm not so convinced they will.
I was saying the other day that I'm sorry. I was saying the other day to someone that I would invest in a company that makes flip phones now, because that would be, I guess, the backup plan, right? If they say to parents, okay, we're banning smartphones, but your kid can have a flip phone in case you want to reach them, talking about school shootings or family emergencies. But I don't know if that's going to be enough of a compromise. What are you saying, Annie?
just similar to Speaker Hastie, the mayor was asked about that this week and made similar comments about wanting to strike a balance between, getting rid of the distraction that cell phones provide, and also addressing parents' concerns about wanting to get in touch with their kids. So that's something that we already know the city is aware of, that backlash, and it, could be a more muted proposal, what we ultimately see because of that.
But it become like an age gated thing where up to a certain age, kids can't have their cell phones in schools, or I guess it's a problem at every level, right?
It just seems so complicated. I mean, the school system is huge. If New York did do this, it would be very influential. It's one of the biggest school districts, if you will, in the whole country. But that's just why I'm not so convinced it can work in practice. Even before the ban was lifted in 2015, kids brought their phones to schools, and now it's 10 years later, and they're just more common than ever. Teens, just like with the Safer Kids Act, we cannot underestimate how wily teenagers can be with their tech. They got a lot of incentive to use it, and they're not going to, let a bunch of adults tell them what to do.
On that note, this has been really, really interesting. Thank you both for joining. This has really been enlightening, and I hope we can do this again very soon. But thank you to Zach Williams from Bloomberg and Annie McDonough from City and State. It's been a pleasure working with both of you over the years, and I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
Well, that was so interesting.
Yeah, no, that was great. I mean, I love listening to the governor, and I love, the reporters really added a fantastic compliment to what she was saying.
So thanks everyone for listening. Thanks to the governor. Thanks to Zach. Thanks to Annie for coming on.
And thanks again to our sponsors and early supporters. Once again, Uber, Spectrum, Civic Hall, TikTok, Google, and Snapchat. Like and subscribe to our podcast on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and iHeart, and tell us your feedback. We'd love to hear it.